to go to, the point of today is focusing in on race and gender and how to think about that in relationship to the process that many of us use around succession planning. And you're already starting to touch on some of the issues associated with that, and we'll get into that much more deeply. And we want to get into it by using a case where we actually show you data from an organization that we've worked with in the past. It's 5 or 6 years old, so the innocent are protected, and we've disguised all the names and whatever, but show you an example and use it as kind of a laboratory to let us think together. I really want you involved and engaged in that discussion about what do we see in the data and what's the implications of what we see and what can we do both before initiating succession planning, during the actual process, and then afterwards. So that's the plan for the next 45 minutes. Okay, with that said, to set the base in terms of succession planning, again, most of you are familiar with succession planning, even if some of you might not regularly practice all the aspects of it based on the survey data. I think what's most important to say around it is that it intersects with other talent processes that you're using in the organization. The output of succession planning really should inform what we do in terms of career development. It should inform what we're looking for from a recruiting standpoint. It should inform compensation decisions. And the performance management process work should really be an input to succession planning to help inform that. And the work that we do around diversity and inclusion should really be on every part of the succession planning, both an input and an output of the process. One key distinction, and again, maybe you're familiar with this, is between replacement planning and succession planning. The harder work is to identify and develop internal successors, and to the point that several of you made a few minutes ago, identifying internal successors who are the right fit for the organization given the community and the populations that we serve. That's the work of succession planning. One thing I think we all try and do in our roles is to manage and reduce risk. And there are a lot of risks, and I bet you've all experienced these, of not doing succession planning and not executing the development plans that come out of succession planning. We've probably all lived with, long vacancies when somebody has left, and the problems that causes for the organization, or in order to avoid that, promoting someone into a job who's really not ready for it and having problems associated with that. So there's a whole bunch of risks that we all live with associated with not doing succession planning. And so one way that I've talked to senior leaders in order to kind of sell them on the idea, it's to minimize risk.
And Mike, what I was going to say too is, right, how often have we heard from exiting staff members, they left because they assumed there was no place to grow in the organization. If they're not seeing these activities happening and they are not engaged in those conversations, they will think that there isn't that pathway for them.
Okay. Good. So let's introduce the idea of bias. And we all know, we've all grown up and been had biases installed in us through no choice of our own, and those biases can be implicit or in some cases explicit, and they really impact our ability to assess talent, to see people's strengths and development needs as they truly are, and not be confused based on past experiences or based on notions that we've gained over, from earlier in our lives about, these kinds of people are like that. So at every step of the way, we need to watch out for implicit bias, and we'll talk more about that as we keep going. So succession planning works best under a few conditions. It works best when the top leaders of the organization really own the responsibility for it, and they're supported by the human resources or the talent function. It's a problem if the organization thinks of succession planning as the talent organization's work. It's got to be the leadership's work. It also works best when key roles are identified that we need to think about from a succession point of view, and that those key roles don't always have to be just the top of the organization. Maybe there's a key role working with youth in your organization, or a key role that analyzes data to support the results that you're trying to achieve that maybe aren't even manager positions, but are critical to the success of the organization. So you need to identify what the key roles are. Another thing that is really important is that it be done regularly. So you don't want to just do succession planning, because somebody just announced their departure. Now all of a sudden we need to do it. It should be done at least annually, and we recommend that it be done twice a year. Another thing that makes succession planning work best is the development plans are co-created. Okay, that should be based both on employee aspirations, what do I hope to do over time, and how the organization perceives me and the organization's needs. So I might hope to do something, but the organization doesn't need anybody to do that. So it's got to be a marriage between the employee's aspirations and the organization's wants and needs. And then finally, it works best when racial and gender, the racial and gender equity lens is applied before, during, and after the core process of succession planning. So there's a few tools that we use. Again, some of you might use these already in your organization, but we call a talent review as the process by which the talent of the organization is evaluated, both in terms of performance and potential, and in terms of who can be a successor to what roles. And we bring leadership or management together to do that process. And the tools that we use to support that are the 9-box, the succession worksheet, and the individual development plan. And we'll talk about each of those briefly. So the 9-box is a matrix of performance and potential. So on the left side is performance from low to high. On the bottom is potential from low to high. And this is a way to create a visual picture of your organization. And in a few minutes, when we come to our case, we're going to show you an example of how this played out in an organization. This just shows the descriptors. You can be high performance, low potential, high performance, high potential, etc. It's not that, some people look at this and say, gee, I want all my people to be high performance, high potential. No, you don't. That causes problems of its own. It's really great to have some people that are high performance, low potential, who just do a great job doing their job, and that's what they want to do for a long time. Okay? Sometimes it's really great to have people that are low performing, high potential. That often means they're new to the organization or new to their role, and there's a lot of growth, and how do we support them to be successful? So what's key when you look at a picture like this is that development plans for people will look different based on how we view them on this performance potential matrix. So when doing this, you obviously need to, you probably have many more rubrics in your organization for what good performance looks like. We probably have most organizations that we've worked with have many fewer ideas about what high potential looks like. This is an example of kind of a generic set of attributes of potential, but we really recommend that each organization needs to think for itself about what does potential look like in our organization. These are common ones. Agility, does somebody learn? Do they take the extra initiative? Do they have a track record of success? And to the extent the organization has leadership competencies already in place, to what extent do their behaviors match those competencies? Another thing to say relative to all of this, though, is there's a big danger of bias in these indicators. So I know we have built leadership competencies for different organizations, and we've had to kind of redo it. And maybe you've done this in your own organizations as well, because we realized that there was bias implicit in it. I think somebody said, I can't remember which one of you said it in your opening comments about wanting to replicate the leadership behaviors of kind of the white male characteristics. Well, if your leadership competencies reflect that, that is bias in and of itself. So you really, and if that becomes a screening criteria, that's big trouble. So you really need to watch out for these areas that we create around assessing people, and specifically around promotability, to make sure that they've been examined and that the bias has been taken out of them. Another tool that we use is the successor chart. So this is for any key role, thinking about who's ready now, who's one job or one experience away, who's two jobs or two experiences away, and then what are the concerns that we have about somebody who's one job away, for example, actually stepping into the role. Why aren't they ready now? And what can we do to help get them to be ready now? With these tools together, the 9-box and the successor chart really inform the development plan that you create for a person. We'll talk more about development plans a little bit later, but the development plan really becomes the final tool that should be the output of the succession planning process.
Great. Thank you for that primer, Mike. So now we're going to turn to the case and actually get into some of the practice and apply these understandings. So what you'll see in a second is an example of a 9-box, right? This is a client who we've worked with and represents what came out of a talent review with them. So I want you to take a second and look at this data. Please note that there are parentheses next to each set of initials, which basically shows both race and gender demographics for each person. So take a second to look at it. And my first question is, what are you seeing? What are you observing in this data?
This is Carol from Innovate Public Schools. I see that the Black employees are in the lower left quadrant and in the middlemost quadrant for the most part, but they're not sprinkled, there's not an even distribution across the board.
Yes.
Of Black people as well as white people. And there's no even distribution, and that's what I would hope to see.
Right. What else do you see?
This is Carol again. The only person that is in the high performance and high potential box is Sam, who is a white male.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Anything else you notice about who's showing up in the high potential across, right? high performance and high potential is a white male? And then who else is showing up in the high potential?
Looks like it's all white people with one Latino, maybe, if that's what the L means. Not sure.
Yeah, that's right.
Another observation I'm having is that everyone's in the middle on both performance and potential. So that leads me to believe there's either some lack of clarity on goals, or this is a new exercise for people to really identify what it means, or the organization is just mediocre in general. So those are some of my thoughts, just being that there's this concentration of folks in the middle.
We won't tell them you said that.
and I think all of those options for theory were probably true at the time. I think all of those things were happening, yes. Any other observations?
There's a comment in the chat box from Alyssa that it's just in general mostly white.
Sorry, I was muted. Hi, everybody. I was trying to figure out the mute here. Yeah, just in general, lots of, when you were asking the question before, I noticed the same thing, that there's one white male in the highest corner that someone else had already noted, and that when you look at the higher potential, there's a lot of, it's mostly white people. I recognize Tracy's voice, and as she noted, one Latina female, but then in general, when you look, there's just a lot of men in the, sorry, I'm new to reading this, but at the very top, right? It's mostly men in that top category, which means high performance, and, you know, moderate potential. So there's like a bias towards just assuming, it seems, that more men are higher performers.
Thank you for that, Alyssa. And Sue mentioned the same thing, right? That there is that trend in the high performers, mostly men. And what questions would you want to surface about this data? Say you are helping to lead your organization through this conversation. How would you inquire about this?
Hi, this is Deb from EHTP again. Hi, Jen, by the way. I think that one thing I would want to ask more about is, like, how are you deciding to put people in what box? Like, if anyone is cuspy, for example, why did you put them into the box that they are in?
Great question. Here's another thing I wanted to raise that I forgot to mention is that this box off to the side, right, is here are the folks who are coming in, right? It's too early to talent review them, but they're new joiners to the organization. Maybe interesting, maybe something to note that they're both white men, right? Is there this understanding now organizationally, even if it's unsaid, that these are the kinds of people who succeed here, if most of the high performers are white men?
Hey, this is Rhonda. I would also want to know what the trends might be by manager to see if, you know, there are some trends with the folks in the middle box or the bottom left box.
Yes, that is a great question. And usually, in this case, there was definitely a correlation there.
And also trends by level.
Mm-hmm.
I would want to know, this is Carol, I would want to know how potential is being measured.
Right.
You know,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say what's going into that potential measurement would be really important, and whether or not that's the same for everybody.
Yeah, I think the magical thing about using a talent review is that it really forces a team to get super clear on how they are defining performance and how they are defining potential, right? And that comes through in the conversation. You're absolutely right to examine how are each of us really looking at this. And then any other actions outside of, you know, prompting with these questions, any other actions that you think you would take to address what you're observing here?
If there's an opportunity, this is Carol again, if there's an opportunity to hear from the employees themselves about their experience, in order to kind of assess what the larger picture is, that would be helpful.
That's a great point. Yeah. I think, as Mike was saying before, how succession planning, talent reviews connect to so many other talent processes. I've seen it be really valuable when an organization is doing staff surveys to understand, are people lacking feedback? Are they getting, developmental attention from their managers? If not, if you see that that's a gap and it's sort of playing out here in the talent review, you can make some of those connections and figure out where you need to sort of like beef up your efforts. That's great.
Yeah. This is Tracy again. One of the things I've often done is try to calibrate across processes. So I'd be curious to actually look at the performance reviews and the compensation increases to see if it's telling us the same story that this chart is telling us. And if not, I think there's opportunity to make adjustments there from both the staff experience perspective and also a fairness and equity perspective across the organization.
That's great. Outside of these I think these are all really great sort of big picture, hey, we need to think about this and calibrate. Is there anything that you think you would do for the folks in that low box?
I would just be curious on the stories of them. This is Alyssa. I just would want general information about, there's the story behind it. So how long have they been on staff, and who are their managers? What do we know about the person's manager? What do we know just about the context of the team, right? I can think of situations where teams had, structural changes or roles changes, and sometimes I have found that there have been performance challenges when a role has changed, but there hasn't been total clarity or support for the staff member in the role. So just information, how long has this person been here? Who's just supporting them? And what additional context is there about their performance or the team? And I think Tracy made such a good point, but what has been communicated also to the staff member? What are their understanding or their expectations about their own level of performance based on what's been communicated would be helpful to know.
That's great.
This is Ariana at EHTP as well with Deb. I think I would also want kind of further proof why they're in that area, right? If they're low performance and low potential, they should probably be on development plans already, as in not the development plan, PIP. They should be on PIP. And I would just want information to show that they are on that, and if they're not on that, why? If they're not on that, how did they end up in this area without being on a PIP already as well?
That makes sense. Yeah, all of these questions and this sort of digging for a little bit more understanding and context, I think is very important. And will help each of the managers who are supporting these folks, supervising these folks, really determine their next steps. Any other things you want to offer? I think a lot of the hypotheses around what has led to the 9-box sort of working out this way, a lot of those hypotheses have sort of come through to the surface in some of the questions you would ask or the things that you would do next. Any other hypotheses that you want to offer about what has led to this 9-box?
I think one of the comments I saw in the chat was a question about what is the racial and gender makeup of the leaders who did this assessment. And I think that's a very important question, and what preparation or training might the leaders who had done this assessment have relative to implicit bias or other other training around race and gender equity overall, I think is a really important one. And again, somebody surfaced it in the chat, but I don't think it's been said out loud yet.
I think that's right. It's almost as though, what comes out of the 9-box it's important for what the performance looks like for each of these folks and potential, but it almost says as much about managers and what may need to happen there with their own skill development. So I think that's right to sort of think about both, right? The names that are showing up here are the direct reports, but there's just as much to be asking, figuring out, doing the support, the manager, equivalents of these people. Great. Thank you all for engaging in that. So moving forward, just some things to think about and tips and ways in which sort of like these approaches really help in handling succession planning, handling these talent review conversations in a way that is keeping track of bias and making sure that you're centering race and gender in the right ways. So one thing that is very important is the language that we're using in talent reviews, right? When working with this client, I remember the first one being very much about kind of getting people back on track, right? Saying, this person's great, superstar, I really like her, right? Or he has really good energy. Doesn't quite tell us enough about truly what are we talking about as far as performance. And so getting people refocused, redirected to what it should sound like, which is, hey, here's some evidence, right? I saw their strength doing this when I saw this, right? This is evident by, here's why, right? So you're really trying to give facts, you're trying to present a clear story when someone is saying, hey, here's my person and this is what I'm assessing as their performance and potential. It should be really clear to other people what it's looking like, right? If that's still cloudy for me and I'm coming away thinking, well, you just like this person a lot, then that means there's more to do there. Yeah.
I mean, just in what Jen's just saying now, this is another place where coded racism or sexism can easily show up. I really like him, or I really like her, or that person's a star, or what. Those kinds of general comments, are places where those implicit biases can really show up, and that's part of why we want to drive for a much more data-focused discussion.
Yes, absolutely, Mike. Another thing I think to note, right, if you're thinking about like me bias or like you bias, right, you're similar to me. And therefore, it's easy to work with you. I really like you. And I think what I've seen time and time again, not just with this organization, but with many organizations I've worked for, is a tendency to not really focus on those folks because you have such an easy time working with them. They work as you would, right? So they do things in the same way that you would, and you're not necessarily supervising with as much attention, potentially, right? So I like you, this person has good energy. What I have found sometimes equates to, I actually don't know that much about their performance, because I'm just feeling good about them. They're great, and so I'm not really as hands-on. And then the flip side is true, right? With people who are, struggling, the manager is assessing that this person is struggling. I've seen it be easier to give examples, right? And I think that, like Mike said, this is a dangerous place, right? If you are not really digging in with all of your direct reports and really truly seeing what their performance is, then the danger is that you're not really equipped to be evaluating everybody accurately.
Jen,
Can I give a specific example there?
Yeah.
I was just at an organization earlier this week, and one of the senior leaders made a comment to me about the culture of the organization, that they put a lot of weight on how people do in delivering presentations. Mm-hmm. And that can really make or break someone's career at that organization if they're really good at standing up and delivering PowerPoint presentations. And some people have been more schooled in how to do that, and other people haven't. Different people have different levels of confidence around doing that kind of thing, and other people have lesser confidence. And if that becomes a criteria for promotability, what are we doing to help people who maybe didn't grow up in a PowerPoint world and didn't grow up being asked at the dinner table to present their thinking, to help them be ready and able. That's part of it, and the other part of it is, is that a just and good criteria?
I think someone was going to jump in before.
Yeah, I was going to add that the point about the like you or like me bias, or when people don't have good data-driven pieces, in the talent review, that can be a great time to ask other people, like, what other data can we add to this? Who else has observations that can enrich this discussion? And you can bring in other voices who maybe don't share that same implicit bias, or the like you, like me, even if it's explicit and being stated that way, that can enrich and sometimes complicate that picture and allow you to pull apart some of the pieces where something's going on that you want to get a closer look at.
I think that's right. And we're going to talk about this in a second, but this really calls for you all to do important work to build trust, to build skills around how to have difficult conversations, because one manager may be holding their direct report up while another has to say, I've actually seen some other evidence, right? And so that really calls for maturity in the group to be able to kind of engage in that way. One more thing I wanted to mention about this slide is that talent reviews really interrupt. This is what we're talking about, succession planning, right? How often, before we have these practices in place, could you say anecdotally, oh, I think people get opportunities in this organization because they work for a manager who likes them, right? And so this sort of interrupts this potential of, we just keep promoting people who is already in leadership, right? Because we don't have the clear qualifications. We aren't in the practices that really get us to define it and uncover our biases. So I think that's another thing that really stems from this. This is not just how to have this conversation, successfully, but what does it wind up leading to? It winds up leading to different choices that are not just default, right? It becomes not okay anymore for people to be promoted without a case.
Yeah. May I ask a tactical question about talent reviews?
Sure.
I've often seen them done at the highest leadership levels within organizations, but some of this evidence-based data that you're asking for would come from a direct line manager. Do you all have a suggestion on how to execute that in our organizations?
Yes. So actually, I can give you an example from this client. We wound up starting with the highest level and really preparing them to have these conversations well, to be able to flex the muscles of how are we defining performance and potential, and to be able to engage in those tough conversations. We wanted to sort of start there and make sure that they had the skills so that when we sort of cascaded this process and went to different levels of management, that they were able to kind of support and hold space, and we actually overlap, right? So we had that highest level of management do these conversations, I think for a whole year. And we had them quarterly to start because we really wanted them to be in this practice using these muscles. After that first year, we rolled it out to the different levels of like directors and managers. And we had the management team folks actually attend in the director one, so that they could show up and model and help sort of process, where are these people falling? And so I think that way of doing it really set things up for success, with leaders really feeling comfortable by the time it came to other managers, able to, sort of give them support in preparing for these conversations, and also taking steps that were necessarily going to come after that.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I would just add, for those of you who have not introduced succession planning yet, this notion of starting with the senior team and then cascading down, I think has proven to be a very successful way of introducing it into the organization. But ultimately, over time, it's great to actually bring this all the way down the organization so that you're identifying people who are doing direct care, or depending on what the organization's service is, who the organization believes has potential to do more. So you're really creating succession for all the way through the organization, not just at the top.
Great. So in again, having these conversations effectively and doing succession planning with the racial and gender equity lens, you want to think about certain things in preparation, during talent review, and also in the next steps, in the follow through. So in preparation, I think we've said a little bit about this already, but how are you training managers, right? Not just to be in these conversations, but to really examine their own biases and making sure that they understand how those are playing out, right? There's a good tool that I know folks have used around implicit bias. There's one at the Kerwin Center's DIY sort of like modules that you can use to have people really about what their implicit bias is. Another idea is to really think about what is the right timing for these conversations, right? I think this is one of the learnings we had with this client as well, that in the busy day-to-day, there's busy day-to-day, and then there are times where other huge org-wide processes are going on, and it's probably a smart thing to kind of figure out what is the least stressful time where we can sort of have this conversation so that people can adequately come to it with the frame of mind they need to really think about this person's performance overall and not have stress kind of inform how they are assessing their team members. And to really take the right time that it requires. So one of the things that I found really helpful was to actually create a form that helped people to prepare their thoughts for the conversation, because without that form, what I was finding was people were just showing up on the day with scribbled notes in a 9-box, but hadn't really thought through carefully, what am I seeing in performance and what am I seeing as potential? And then in the talent review, the whole idea of doing this as a group, right, is that it helps you to calibrate the norms around how are we thinking about what performance looks like here, what high performance means, what is that bar, what does it look like to be a strong manager of people. I think that was another big conversation that happened with this client. So it helps you to calibrate, how are we thinking about these things in the organization. When you're doing this, right, if you are the leader, and this is another thing, over time, teaching other people to be able to facilitate these conversations and being watchers for where is bias coming up, right? Because this conversation can happen, but I think it takes a strong facilitator to kind of point out, like, hold on, let's dig into that a little bit more. What I'm hearing doesn't quite sound like, evidence, or what I'm hearing sounds like you have a preference for this. Is that what's really required of this role? So having a spotter to really kind of lift up these moments and make sure that the group is tackling it and asking themselves, right, is this a moment of bias that we have to uncover? And then to the point that we made before, right, looking at the data, looking at that output is really important. Right, that exercise that we did to start this whole thing off, what are you noticing here? What does it mean for us? What is this actually calling us to do? Do we see trends that are unsettling that we're going to need to respond to? And then in the follow through, it usually leads you to think, what training do people need, right? Where do managers need training to be evaluating their people? Okay, once that evaluation is there, what training do they need to kind of build skills in their people, right? Because you might evaluate them as low performance, but that doesn't mean you know what to do to get them to medium, right? To meeting expectations. Similarly, is there anything that you have to do to respond to any trends that you see in the 9-box to support the staff, right? If there are folks winding up in this low box, what does that mean? And what does that trend look like? Is there something that you can do to kind of support through mentoring or coaching that really helps those people to be more successful in their roles? And then another question to be asking is around patterns for allocation of resources, right? Where do we see people succeeding? Where do we see people getting opportunities? And is there something that's indicating bias even in that? So this is the sort of thinking that you want to do and the actions you want to take at each of these levels as you do this work.
Hey, and quick question for you. We're really trying to figure out how we should be weighting performance and potential. How often do you run into that with clients? And do you have any advice as we think about the 9 box on how we should weight those organizationally?
How to weight them?
Yeah, like I'm trying to figure out what's our position on like what we value more, and different managers have a different answer to that question, which leads us kind of in circles as we try to think about talent.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, my sense is that there are probably things that are shared across the entire organization and that is valued across teams. But then what I have found definitely working with this organization is that there wound up being quite a bit of nuance for what was important, you know, team by team. So I think eventually you can get to a place where you have that drawn out, right? What does it look like to be meeting expectations and exceeding expectations in this role, in this team? It's going to look different, you know, when the work change, the functional work changes. But I think that's part of the conversation, you know, in these talent reviews, is to really understand how that's being defined, and then to make sure, of course, that there aren't biases showing up by team, but that they are really connecting to the purpose of the roles and what you're actually trying to have those roles achieve.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. I'm looking at time. Speed up. So one of the things that we also think is really helpful is to have this kind of a discussion with the team, right? What is the risk of not having career and development conversations with everyone? Talent reviews do trigger conversations about career development planning. What do folks want to do? What do they see for themselves? A pitfall I have seen where bias plays out is managers assuming they know what their people want, or having ideas. It's a little bit paternalistic at times. I know what you should do, right? That's not centering equity. It's not centering inclusion. You want folks to have some self-determination and be able to engage in these conversations. You should definitely have some ideas as a manager for how you will support them in the path, but you really want to engage folks, all folks, around what they see for themselves and where they're hoping to grow in the organization. I think quickly, you know, I sort of weighed in as we went through my own reflections from working with this client. I think the addition that I would offer is that the big lesson that we took here is that we really didn't have, a lot of folks were kind of struggling in the low performance, even the medium, and even the middle performance. Indicated managers didn't quite have the skills to manage well. So a lot of new managers, or a lot of managers who just never got trained and really didn't have the right accountabilities, didn't have the right development opportunities. And so that became really important to us to kind of infuse support to the managers who were, you know, supervising all of these people. One thing that I will say too is that we wound up for that low box, we digged a little bit more. We did see some patterns in who the managers were, and we realized they were less experienced managers. And we actually created a program. They were on improvement plans, and so we basically went to those pairs of manager and direct report and gave them both coaching. So we created a whole internal coaching program that really supported them, and with the whole, you know, hope of getting them out of low and into meeting. And out of the 3 people we did that with, we actually saw that change, and everybody sort of got off the improvement plan and actually became even more successful in their roles, because we really infused with support and development and tried to give them, you know, skills that they hadn't had before. What doesn't work is to say, okay, this has to change and let us know how it goes, right? So we really wanted to support each part of the pair, since each part of the pair were really kind of playing a part in this dynamic. Anything else you would add, Mike?
Well, maybe some given where we are, maybe some closing thoughts. There's been a lot of good comments in the chat. We're not going to have a chance to respond, I think, anymore right now. But one thing we do want to say is that we will send this deck out to everybody on the call, as well as a list of additional resources. And obviously invite anyone who has further questions or would like some help to reach out to us. I guess some final thoughts from me relative to all this and what I've learned over doing this for a long time is we really need to be strong and bold in our interventions in this area. You know, many leaders are comfortable, you know, as we said, with the like me bias or whatever, and we have to be willing to weigh in and really interrupt and take stands as we facilitate and support our organizations around these activities. And that's at every step of the way, both in the prep, the during, and the post. None of this, in terms of using the tools of the 9-box, the successor chart, having the discussions, has real teeth to it unless there are good development plans. That's really what makes a difference. And are we thinking about who we want to invest in relative to those development plans? Okay. And one thing that I have tended to see is people coming up with development plans that put it all on the employee. Here are the things you can do if you want to improve in these areas. And I think it's really important, especially to help the organization reflect the community that it serves, for managers to sign up to say, here's what I am going to do to help this employee develop, so that the manager takes responsibility for development as much as the employee does. And then tracking, part of the reason why we recommend doing these kinds of talent reviews more than once a year is so that you actually have the development actions that we had discussed in the last talent review occurred, and what needs to happen to support them to occur. Obviously, we just need to keep our mindset on race and gender equity through every step of this, making sure, you know, not only in the succession planning process, but I think as and one of you talked about it is, you know, is it showing up in the performance management and the compensation process as well or not? And so really using this lens to keep everything focused the way that we are trying to make a difference for our organizations is critical. So with that, we have used our allocated hour. We hope that this has been really useful for you. We welcome you to reach out to us. You know, we're glad to help you around in this area. And again, we're going to send out this package to you that includes some bonus tools, some of which we kind of glossed over relatively quickly. So thanks everybody for your attention. Have a good rest of your Friday.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.